Good morning. We're here at SIT in Brattleboro, Vermont, and we're here talking with Bruce Dayton and Imraan Buccus about the Peace and Justice Leadership degree. We're very pleased to be reintroducing this degree. It's a historic degree for SIT and one that we've offered for many, many years. And we'd like to talk about the new format and the way this degree is going to look going forward. So I'd like to ask our two guests to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the degree itself.
Okay, hi Kate. Hi everybody out there. So I'm Bruce Dayton. I am the chair and associate professor in the Peace and Justice Leadership degree that we're going to be talking about today. I'm also the executive director of a program at SIT that's run for 20 years called the Contact Peacebuilding Program, which I'll explain in a little bit, but that's going to be part of the new degree. And I'm a political scientist by training. My PhD is in political science, but I'm very interested in political psychology and the social psychology of conflict. And in the early part of my career, I worked mainly on environmental and public policy disputes, but later on in my career, I became very interested in identity conflicts, and particularly ones that become violent and intractable. So that's been part of both my training and my research for a number of years.
Yeah, so I'm Imraan Buccus, the academic director of the Social and Political Transformation Program in Durban, South Africa. Also research fellow in the School of Politics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which historically was also called the University of Durban-Westville, and earned in the late 80s the title of being the intellectual home of the left. So a great number of people that came out of the university are now serving in the post-apartheid government. I also have my roots in student activism, the student movement in Durban in South Africa. And I think, like is well known, the student movement was a central part of the anti-apartheid struggle. There were many components, within the country, outside the country, but arguably I think when students had resolved to make the country ungovernable, the student movement sort of emerged as almost the central pivot, and it's maybe something we can talk about later on. I also have a huge interest in media, activist media historically on campus, but later on now as a columnist for several newspapers.
So Bruce, can you connect the dots for us here a little bit? What does the South Africa program and Imraan's work have to do with the Peace and Justice degree? What does this...
Sure. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of that. If you choose to come here for this degree, what it's going to look like, what the format is going to be, and what you'll study. So again, the degree is in Peace and Justice Leadership, and we've chosen those two words very carefully because there's a natural tension between peace and justice that we hope to explore in the degree. But I think of the degree as training people to look at both the theory and practice of peace and justice promotion. And from a theoretical standpoint, what I'm most interested in working with students on is issues of conflict. So for instance, what causes conflicts to emerge? Why do some conflicts emerge and some escalate? Why do some take a turn towards de-escalation and become settled? What are the variables within communities, within organizations, within the international society that explain this cycle of conflict? Why it gets worse, why it gets better, and why so many conflicts seem to be solved or settled and then they reemerge in new forms. So how do we understand that? And there's a number of different theories, mostly from the social sciences and social psychology, political science, economics, that all have different views on what explains the emergence and escalation and de-escalation of conflict. So from a theoretical standpoint, we look mainly at those theories to understand them. From a practical standpoint, it's not just enough to understand the theories of conflicts and why they escalate and emerge and de-escalate, but then what can we do about them? So the degree will give students skills for things, for instance, like how to map conflicts, how to understand who the stakeholders are, what their history is how to look at them visually, how to understand the different dynamics that drive them. The skills and practice that students will learn is how do you manage and work with intercultural teams, particularly as a leader. Certainly in the United States, we're particularly now in an era where you're not going to work on a team with people just like you. So how do you manage difference? How do you work with intercultural difference? Then there's the hard skills of conflict transformation and peace building, things like negotiation and dialogue and mediation. So how do leaders learn those skills? When do you apply them? Skills like monitoring and evaluation. So we'll do some work on that. So how do you know the interventions in conflict or justice promotion programs you design? How do you know if they're effective? What is effective? How do you measure those things? And then some very practical skills. We'll be working with some faculty that will be teaching specifically on how do you write grants? How do you write policy briefs? How do you try to impact the policy community? And the partners we'll be working with, we have two in Washington. The Alliance for Peace Building is one of our partners. That's going to be connecting our students to peace and justice organizations around the world for a capstone project. And the U.S. Institute of Peace will be another partner that will be teaching some of our courses with Imraan and myself. And then just lastly, on the format of this degree, it's a part-time low-residency degree. So the idea is that if you're a working professional and you can't take a year and a half off to take a master's degree full-time, you can stay in your job, take this degree, which is about 2 courses per semester, which is half-time for us. And low residency means part of the coursework is face-to-face and part of it is online. And there's actually 2 residencies that students would participate. The first is at the Contact Summer Peace Building Program every June in Brattleboro, and then we'll have a week in Washington, D.C. working with professional peace building organizations. And the second residency is this really new exciting partnership we've developed with Imraan and his program in South Africa, where students, the second year of the program, will spend about 2 weeks in South Africa learning about South Africa as a case. And maybe this is a good time to turn to Imraan and have him say a little bit more about why the South African case is so interesting to look at and what's happening in South Africa today that really would add some value to students that are really trying to understand this dimension of peace and justice and conflict transformation.
Yeah, but maybe let me rewind a bit and talk about the sort of connections between these 2 countries, the US and South Africa. So our liberation movement, the African National Congress, was founded by Pixley Kaseme and John Dube. Late 1800s, early 1900s, Pixley Kaseme worked at Columbia on a PhD, and John Dube went to Oberlin. So sort of US academic institutions made a huge contribution to the founders of our own democracy. And interestingly, both these leaders are from Durban. So I think socio-politically, historically, culturally, Durban's a very rich city. So it has that link. And I think later on, when you think about the civil rights movement here in the US in the 50s and 60s, when you think about Rosa Parks here, we have Rosa Parks in South Africa in the form of Lillian and Goyi. When you think later on about Martin Luther King and Gandhi, I think when you go to the King Center, one of the portraits you're greeted by is a portrait of Gandhi. Gandhi being in South Africa, 1893 to 1913, had a huge influence on Martin Luther King. And I think later on, even when you think about the theorizing of race in the US with Malik al-Shabazz or Malcolm X, we had the equivalent in South Africa with Stephen Bantu Biko. So there is that, I think, very strong connection historically. And if you bring it to the present day, and you know why South Africa, I think, would be of huge interest to a student wanting to study peace and social justice leadership. One is the idea of Luthuli. Luthuli was the first African Nobel laureate in the world, president of the ANC. He was a man of the church. The ANC had taken a decision in the 60s when Mandela committed to violence that we're going to go with the armed struggle. And Luthuli was a man of peace and then gets the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think there's a whole range of things we can talk about, the contradictions in the African National Congress itself, its commitment to the armed struggle, having people like Luthuli. And I think students being in South Africa will get a chance to go to Luthuli's home, to learn about Luthuli, to also learn about the contradictions of a person like Gandhi. Gandhi was a person, he came from India, but his political education was South African. Inspired by the mobilization in the late 1800s, formed the Natal Indian Congress in the 1890s, linked to the ANC, man of peace, and students would get to visit his home, visit his granddaughter, talk about that and its contribution to South Africa. And of course Mandela, a figure that's become hugely romanticized in the world. And I think students coming to South Africa will have the opportunity to engage with really difficult questions. We spoke earlier on about how student activism was a central pivot in our struggle. Student activism has re-emerged as central to our struggle today. And I think what Bruce was talking about earlier about, how conflict escalates, de-escalates, re-emerges. In South Africa, I think we've romanticized our miracle a great deal, but there's a re-emergence of conflict. Young people, particularly in a country like South Africa, where 50% of people are under 30, and the vast majority unemployed and desperately poor, are starting to ask really awkward questions about Mandela. Mandela the sellout. Why do we romanticize Mandela? I don't have a job, I don't have a home, I live in poverty. What does a really liberal, progressive constitution mean to me? Why are young people taking to the streets? South Africa today has become the most protest-rich country in the world. About 5,600 protests annually, So I think all of these things make South Africa a really relevant context, really, I think, potent social laboratory for students wanting to think and talk about this. And it's so fluid. We talk about conflict, it's happening as you're there. We talk about Mandela and the debates about him, it's happening as you're there. And whether you talk about gender or housing or informality in trade or sexuality, all of these things are being debated. And it also kind of points to us how short a time 24, 25 years is in a life of a democracy.
That's fascinating, and also because I think now when you look at South Africa, and then you also take that out to a 30,000-foot view of what's happening in the world. I was just reading the other day about the Global Peace Index and how peace is actually on the decline and conflict is increasing. So talk more about, Bruce, let's start with you. Let's talk about why this degree is particularly relevant at this point in our history, our world history.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Global Peace Index because that brings up a central question around this degree. It's called Peace and Justice Leadership. What is peace? And the Global Peace Index is one effort by an international group of academics and activists to define it. But different people define it in different ways. What does a good society look like? What does a peaceful society look like? And the great contribution of the Global Peace Index and people like Johan Galtung is they really looked at the question of peace and said, well, peace isn't just the absence of violence. Peace means the quality of connections between people and communities. Peace means access to education. Peace may mean equality before the law. So there's a whole number of indicators that we take into account where we think about, well, what does it mean to build peaceful societies? It's not just societies where people aren't harming and hurting each other and there's not an active war. Maybe it's a society where there's some degree of equality before the law, some degree of dialogue between people in conflict, some choice of conflict management techniques that aren't highly destructive. So to me, I'm not sure what the definition of peace is, but I think just looking at this question of what is peace and what do just societies look like is really central to the degree. And as for the question of why we need it now, well, I'll speak for the United States. Maybe you can provide some more thoughts about what's happening in South Africa. But certainly, if you look at what's happening in the United States now, we're losing the capacity to communicate to each other. There's really two things happening. We're losing the capacity to work across borders, whatever those borders are. Religious borders, racial borders, ideological borders, political borders. And the norm in the United States of being able to talk about divisive subjects in ways that are constructive really feels to me like it's eroding, and that's a big problem. And then underlying this, and equally disturbing, is the erosion of democracy, which to me is equality before the law, pluralistic political systems, systems where there's compromise and consensus as decision-making norms, inclusion in decision-making. So I worry also that we are losing the capacity to act in ways that, to me, are the essence of good democratic societies. And it's worth fighting for getting those things back. That's the justice part. The conflict management and peace part is it's also worth figuring out how can we communicate more effectively across borders. So I think why now is, in my mind, we really need a new generation of leaders that both are willing to wage conflict in constructive ways and push for peace, maybe sometimes even using coercion, whether those are protests or other forms of tactics that bring to light great injustices, but also a new generation of leaders that know how to do dialogue and consensus building and mediation and principled negotiation, and don't just simply turn to coercion as the one tool of conflict management that they know and use. Because the tragedy of the present era is we know so much about how to wage conflicts in more constructive ways, but leader after leader reaches for the most destructive tools. So I'm really interested to hear you talk a little bit about the South Africa case, because the question to me is, what tools do we choose, right? What methods do we use? Do we choose to wage our conflicts, and which ones tend to be more effective and which are least effective, and under what circumstances, and even all the way up to armed struggle. You know, I have pacifist friends that say never armed struggle, never violence. But I have other friends who look at the South Africa case and say the use of armed struggle was a critical tool.
Absolutely.
But it was used judiciously in addition to the use of other kinds of tools that didn't foreclose the capacity for a post-conflict South African society to emerge, where it wasn't just based on the legacy of an armed struggle. So I'm really interested in those issues, and I think that we really need a generation of leaders that are able to make those decisions and lead for change in more powerful, enduring, sustainable, and less coercive and violent ways.
I think this really speaks to what an interesting context South Africa would be for students. So if you take a figure like Mandela, well known in the world and well known in the US, fully committed to peace until about 1960. And when the white regime of South Africa, the nationalist regime, continues to kill black people in protests, especially in Sharpeville in 1960, Mandela gives this really famous BBC interview where he says we cannot continue with unarmed response when a government, unleashes this kind of violence on people, and then officially undertakes an armed struggle, bringing us up to about the early 90s. And in 94 we had an option. The option was either continue the war against the white administration or the Nationalist Party, or have a negotiated settlement. In the South African case, many of us as young radicals then said no to peace, right? And we said the option of peace was going to be a destructive one and not a useful one, because it would mean that we'll have a political democracy, but the economy would remain in white hands. The decision Mandela took in his wisdom was, we need to go for peace because we don't have the capacity to take on the Nationalist Party. And we celebrated that as the miracle of South Africa. But what it did was, it led through neoliberalism and a whole range of other things, an increase in poverty, an increase in inequality. What it's done today is it's created huge social fractures. So when the young man Mohamed Bouazizi in 2011 on the streets of Tunis sets himself alight and gives rise to what we now know as the Arab Spring, and when we think about that, the sort of ingredient for revolution was youth unemployment and poverty. What young people are asking in South Africa today is, do we not have the same ingredients? Absolutely. Youth are impatient, desperately poor, unemployed. The middle classes are receding. Private schools, gated estates, private security, right? And the idea is, the further back we move away from poor people, the safer we'd be. And I think all of that is really important to look at in the South African context, because it's just so dangerous, So there is a re-emergence of conflict in South Africa. And I think the impatience that people are sort of going through today really requires for, I think, young leaders to emerge and rethink where we're at. And for me, I think the sort of only prevention, or the only factor that's going to help, is addressing the needs of people in terms of health, education, and social mobility.
So whether we're talking about an emerging democracy, if that's the right way to put it, or a devolving democracy, which is perhaps what we're beginning to see in this country, we're really talking about creating resilient societies, right? Societies that are able to navigate and manage the challenges that are components in conflict in either case. And I think this degree would speak to people who are interested in addressing those issues either on a regional level, or a national level, or an international level. Am I correct in that?
Sure. I think the field is interested in communities, what happens in communities like Brattleboro, and how you create resilient systems and manage conflicts and manage difference, as well as at the national level or the international level. It's very scalable. Most of the theories and ideas about how to work with conflict work just as well at the community level as they do at the international level, in my experience anyways. So yeah, I think it's a very scalable degree depending on what you want to look at. And South Africa is a case, and you're right, what is the case in the United States? And there are young people in this country who are increasingly dissatisfied and believe that the system isn't fair. And what happens in societies and communities where people stop believing that there is equity before the law, there is fairness before the law, that the justice system works the same for one group as another. So it's a concern about the erosion of the foundations of stability in societies, which is trust in institutions and trust in the stories that our institutions are telling us, that really is at stake. And I'm hoping students look at whether they're interested again at the community level or organizational or international level.
So we just have a few more minutes. Let's talk, while we have some time, about who would come to this program, and what types of careers or directions it would prepare them for.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping everyone will come to the program. So I don't want to set it up as the program is just for this type of person. I mean, clearly we have set up the program to be part-time with 2 substantial residencies. That means that you can work and get the degree. So that's one thing.
And the South Africa piece is how long?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's still doable for someone who's working in a
Right. It's 3 weeks at the start of the program, 2 weeks a year later. So it's meant to appeal to people who want to keep their jobs and maybe advance in their careers, or don't have a master's degree but can't really quit their jobs in order to get a master's degree. But I also think increasingly undergraduate students who are leaving traditional colleges are looking for different types of degrees, and this offers a different look at what a master's degree looks like. So I think it appeals to them. I hope it appeals to them too. And you can be interested in peace education, in community change work, in diplomacy, in international development, in social activism and civil resistance campaigns, and probably have a career across a range of different organizations, from non-governmental organizations to community nonprofit organizations to government entities like the U.S. Agency for International Development, to intergovernmental organizations like the European Union or the United Nations. So I think there's a wide variety of career possibilities, and mainly what we're looking for is people who want to create change, people who are dissatisfied with the current conditions, want to gain some leadership skills, want to understand processes of conflicts a little better, and be able to design and manage peace and justice programming to bring about change in their community or the world.
And Imraan, you're working with a population of primarily U.S. undergraduate students now. Do you see this as something that would resonate with them as they continue to look at an academic or a career path?
Oh no, absolutely. I think we've had several students who do the program, social and political transformation, and are often asking about coming back to South Africa, wanting to look at peace building, wanting to look at peace and social justice. We've had several students come back and do an MA in South Africa. Some of them have stayed. So I think a program like this would have huge resonance with students wanting to come back. And I think we talk so much on the program about ideas of reciprocity, coming back to societies where you were hosted, contributing. So already we have students, living in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, some in South Africa, and a significant number of them involved in issues of development, conflict resolution. So I think this would be a much needed additional possibility for them.
And of course, we didn't even cover SIT's very unique approach to education, which is very experiential, very reflective. I think we're out of time, but we would just like to say that we are enrolling for this program now, and it starts in June of 2019. Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. Okay. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks, Kate.
We really appreciated talking with you.
Thank you.